The linoleum of the Valley Mart was a constellation of scuffs and grime, each mark a tiny history of haste and indifference. Samuel Vance knew the geography of this floor well. He knew which tiles were loose, which aisle held the cheapest brand of coffee, and which checkout lane had the cashier who wouldn't look at his leg. Today he had chosen poorly. The young woman at Register 3, barely out of high school, kept letting her eyes drift down to where his worn denim creased unnaturally just above the knee, a telltale sign of the complex machinery hidden beneath. Sam felt the familiar, dull heat of shame rise in his neck. It was a phantom limb of its own, this recurring ghost of humiliation, an ache for a wholeness that had been vaporized in a cloud of Afghan dust 12 years ago. He placed his meager items on the conveyor belt. A loaf of day-old bread, a carton of milk nearing its expiration date, a dented can of beef stew, and a small bag of generic coffee. The sum total of his world for the next 3 days. His hand, etched with the fine, pale lines of scar tissue, trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket for the crumpled bills and loose change. The tremor was a souvenir from the same event that had claimed his leg, a permanent vibration in his nervous system that made simple tasks like counting coins a public performance of his brokenness. He could feel the impatience radiating from the person behind him, a heavy, oppressive wave of annoyance. He didn't need to look to know someone was there, tapping their foot, sighing with theatrical frustration. In a small town like Harmony Creek, privacy was a luxury, and anonymity was impossible for a man who walked with a permanent, rhythmic limp. Sam meticulously counted out the coins, his fingers fumbling with the dimes and pennies. The total was $7.42. He had $7.50, 8 cents to spare. A good day. He pushed the coins across the counter, avoiding the cashier's pitying gaze. It was the pity that was worst, not the revulsion, not the annoyance, but the soft, suffocating sympathy of people who couldn't possibly understand the price of the ground they walked on. He preferred their impatience. It was more honest. As the cashier bagged his items, the pressure from behind intensified. A voice, slick with unearned confidence and cheap cologne, sliced through the quiet hum of the store's refrigerators. "Jesus, are we done here? Some of us have places to be. Can't have the whole world waiting on some gimp to count his pennies." The voice belonged to Ricky Thorne. Sam didn't turn around. He had seen Rick around town, a man in his late 20s who carried himself with the swagger of a high school quarterback who never realized the game had ended. He drove a loud, obnoxious truck, wore clothes that cost more than Sam's monthly disability check, and treated the town like his personal kingdom. Sam focused on the plastic bag, on the simple act of taking his food and leaving. He had learned long ago that confrontation was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. His reserves were already depleted, spent on fighting nightmares and the relentless grinding pain in his hip. He reached for his bag, his one good hand closing around the thin plastic handles. This was the moment of conflict, the spark hitting the tinder. The shove was not violent, but it was brutally effective. It wasn't meant to injure, merely to assert dominance, to dismiss. Ricky Thorne's hand landed squarely between Sam's shoulder blades, a contemptuous push. For a man with 2 legs, it would have been a stumble, an annoyance. For Sam, it was a catastrophic failure of engineering. His prosthetic leg, not designed for sudden lateral force, buckled. His center of gravity vanished. The world tilted, the fluorescent lights of the ceiling smearing into a sickening blur. He fell sideways, his hips striking the hard floor with a sickening crack of bone on tile that echoed in the sudden, sharp silence of the store. The plastic bag tore from his grasp. The milk carton exploded, sending a spray of white across the grimy floor. The can of stew skittered away, rolling under a display of cheap magazines. The loaf of bread landed softly beside his head, a pathetic, doughy pillow. Humiliation, cold and absolute, washed over him. He lay there, a broken soldier on a battlefield of spilled milk and public apathy. The laughter of Ricky Thorne and his 2 friends the only sound in a world that had frozen to watch him fall. Lying on the cold, sticky floor of the Valley Mart, the scent of spilled milk sharp in his nostrils, Sam Vance was not in Harmony Creek. He was 12 years and 7,000 miles away, pinned down behind a crumbling mud brick wall under the unforgiving glare of the Kandahar sun. The air was thick with cordite and fear, the rhythmic chatter of a distant PKM machine gun, a deadly metronome counting down their lives. The ground shuddered, not from a shove, but from the deafening, world-ending roar of an IED. He remembered the flash of white light, the sensation of being lifted and thrown, the sudden, shocking silence that followed the blast before the screaming started. His screaming, and another's, Corporal Danny Miller, his friend, his brother in all but blood, was lying beside him, his eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade. Danny's last words were not a plea for a medic or a cry for his mother. They were a simple, desperate request whispered through a bloody haze. "Live good, Sam. Just live a good one. For both of us." That promise had become the central pillar of Sam's existence. It was the reason he got out of bed each morning when the phantom pains in his missing leg felt like hot pokers twisting in raw nerve. It was why he endured the quiet indignities of a world that had forgotten his sacrifice, a world that saw a broken man, not a soldier who had given a piece of himself to protect it. Living a good life, a quiet life, an honorable one, that was the mission now. It didn't involve firefights or acts of valor that earned medals. It involved biting back the rage when a punk like Ricky Thorne called him a gimp. It involved finding dignity in poverty, strength in solitude. He had fought his war. He had seen enough violence to last 1,000 lifetimes. Raising a fist to a man like Rick would be a betrayal of Danny's memory. It would be an admission that the war had followed him home and won, turning him into the very thing he'd fought against. A man who solved his problems with brute force and anger. So he held on to that promise, that crumbling mud brick wall in his mind, the one thing that still held firm when everything else had been blown away. This quiet endurance was a discipline forged in the crucible of loss. After the hospital, after the endless physical therapy sessions and the clumsy attempts to reintegrate into a civilian world that moved too fast, he had retreated. He had his small house at the edge of town, his disability check, and his memories. He didn't ask for help. He didn't talk about his service. The faded ranger patch on his old fatigue jacket was the only clue to his past, and most people didn't know what it meant anyway. They saw a man in his early 40s who looked 60, a man who kept to himself, whose eyes held a permanent shadow. They saw weakness, fragility. They didn't see the iron will it took just to walk to the store. They didn't see the courage it took to face each day. They saw a cripple holding up the line, and that was all. He was a ghost in his own town, a living monument to a forgotten war, and his invisibility was both a shield and a curse. The silence in the Valley Mart stretched into a thick, suffocating blanket. It was a silence of complicity, of cowardice. Every eye was on the scene, yet every eye avoided true engagement. The cashier, a girl named Sarah with bright pink streaks in her hair, had her hand frozen over the scanner, her mouth slightly agape. A man in a business suit further back in line meticulously studied the expiration date on a carton of yogurt. A mother with 2 young children pulled them closer, shielding their view as if Sam's brokenness were a communicable disease. No one moved. No one spoke. No one offered a hand. It was the bystander effect in its purest, most cruel form. They were all waiting for someone else to act, for the uncomfortable moment to pass so they could return to the mundane rhythm of their afternoon errands. Ricky Thorne stood over Sam, basking in the power of the moment. He was a performer, and this silent, captive audience was his stage. He smirked, kicking lightly at the dented can of stew. "Look at that," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even hold onto his dinner. Maybe you should get one of those little motorized carts next time, old man. Keep you from being a hazard to the public." His 2 friends, lanky youths who orbited Rick like pilot fish, snickered on cue. The laughter, sharp and ugly, finally broke the spell, but not in the way one might hope. It didn't spur anyone to action. It simply gave them permission to look away, to shuffle their feet, to pretend they hadn't heard. Their silence was an endorsement. For Sam, this was the real wound. The fall had hurt, his hips screaming in protest, but the collective indifference of his neighbors cut deeper than any physical pain. It was the confirmation of his deepest fear, that he had become invisible, that his sacrifice had been rendered meaningless, that he was nothing more than an inconvenience. He could feel their judgment, their unspoken thoughts. He's probably drunk. He's unstable. Better not to get involved. Each silent glance was a tiny nail hammered into the coffin of his self-worth. He met the cashier Sarah's eyes for a fleeting second. He saw a flicker of something there. Pity, maybe even shame, but it was quickly extinguished. She looked down, busying herself by wiping an imaginary smudge from the counter. The pressure wasn't just from Rick's arrogance. It was from the crushing weight of an entire community's apathy. He was utterly, completely alone, a man down in a room full of people. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a slow, rattling breath, and began the arduous process of putting himself back together, one painful movement at a time. With a grunt of effort that was pure agony, Sam pushed himself from his side onto his hands and knees. The motion sent a jolt of fire up his spine from his bruised hip. He ignored it. He ignored Rick's sneering face and the averted gazes of the other shoppers. His world narrowed to the few square feet of soiled linoleum around him. His mission now was simple: retrieve what was his and get out. He saw the loaf of bread first, miraculously unharmed. He reached for it, his hand steady despite the tremors, and tucked it under his arm. Next, he focused on the mess of spilled milk and broken glass from a jar of pickles he hadn't even realized he'd dropped. With a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of a deep, ingrained discipline, he began to push the shards of glass into a neat little pile with the side of his hand. It was an act of profound, almost absurd consideration. In the midst of his own public degradation, his instinct was to protect the store workers from getting cut. Once the glass was contained, he crawled toward the counter, using it to haul himself upright. The effort left him breathless, sweat beading on his forehead. He leaned against the counter for a moment, his knuckles white. He looked at the cashier. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills and the few remaining coins. He had already paid, but he pushed a dollar bill across the counter. For the pickle jar, he then turned and limped out of the store, leaving his exploded milk carton and the dented can of stew behind. He didn't look back. The cold afternoon air was a relief, washing over his heated skin. He stood on the sidewalk, taking a moment to reorient himself. His dinner was gone, his body ached, and his spirit felt scraped raw. Across the parking lot, huddled against the brick wall of the neighboring laundromat, sat a man Sam recognized. He was a fixture in town, a homeless man named Earl whose face was a roadmap of hard living. Earl was shivering, wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket that offered little protection against the biting wind. Their eyes met. In that instant, Sam saw a reflection of his own isolation, his own struggle. Without a second of hesitation, Sam limped across the asphalt. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the dented can of stew he had just retrieved from the store floor. It was his last can, his only prospect for a hot meal. He held it out to Earl. The homeless man looked at the can, then back at Sam's face, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You sure?" Earl rasped, his voice gravelly. Sam simply nodded, pressing the can into Earl's cold, chapped hands. "Stay warm," Sam said. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of a shared battle against a world that had cast them both aside. He then turned and began his long, painful walk home, his own hunger a distant echo to the quiet, unyielding call of Danny Miller's final words, "Live a good one, Sam." Sarah, the cashier, watched the entire exchange through the Valley Mart's large plate glass window. She had watched Sam gather the broken glass. She had watched him apologize for a mess he didn't make. And now, she had watched him give his only can of food to a homeless man. A wave of shame so powerful it made her physically nauseous washed over her. She had stood there, silent and useless, while a good man was humiliated. Her inaction felt like a betrayal of something deep and fundamental. Her grandfather, a proud Marine who fought in Vietnam, had always told her, Silence in the face of evil is itself evil today. She had been silent. The thought was unbearable. She looked over at Rick Thorne, who was now laughing with his friends as he paid for a case of expensive craft beer, completely oblivious to the moral drama that had just unfolded. The sight of his smug, entitled face filled her with a cold fury. Her eyes drifted back to Sam's retreating figure. She noticed, for the first time, the small olive-drab patch on the shoulder of his worn fatigue jacket. It was faded and frayed at the edges, but the embroidered symbols were still visible. A vertical black rectangle with 3 white stripes. She didn't recognize it, but it looked official, military. Driven by a sudden, fierce need to do something, anything, to right this terrible wrong, she pulled out her phone. Her older brother, Mike, wasn't a Hell's Angel, but he rode with a local club, the Sons of Perdition. He was part of that world, a world that operated on a different set of rules, a world where respect was earned and disrespect was answered. She quickly typed out a text, her thumbs flying across the screen. Mike, something awful just happened at the store. This guy, Rick Thorne, knocked down this older disabled vet. A real hero, I think. Nobody did anything. I feel sick. She paused, then added another line. He had this patch on his jacket. Black rectangle, 3 white stripes. She hit send. The response came back almost instantly. What did you say the patch was? She described it again. A few moments passed, then another text from Mike appeared. This one with a different tone, sharp and urgent. Sarah, where does this vet live? She didn't know. I'll find out, she typed back. She went to the store manager, a mousy man named Mr. Henderson who had made himself scarce during the incident. Playing on his guilt, she convinced him to look up Sam's address from a check he had written last month. It was an invasion of privacy, but it felt like a necessary one. She texted the address to her brother. The final reply from Mike was chilling. Got it. The right people will hear about this. Stay out of it now. A network had been activated. A signal had been sent. The quiet, orderly world of Harmony Creek was about to intersect with a force it did not understand. A force summoned by a single act of selfless dignity. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. On the quiet, tree-lined street where Ricky Thorne lived, the only sounds were the distant bark of a dog and the gentle whisper of wind through the autumn leaves. It was the picture of suburban tranquility. Then came the sound. It started as a low, guttural vibration. A tremor felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a sound that didn't belong here. A deep, syncopated growl that seemed to rise from the very asphalt. The rumble grew steadily, multiplying, layering over itself until it became a deafening, rolling thunder that shook the windows in their frames. Heads began to appear in doorways. Curtains were pulled back. The residents of Sycamore Lane stared in disbelief as the source of the sound came into view. The first motorcycle turned the corner, a massive Harley-Davidson Street Glide, its chrome engine catching the last rays of sunlight like a chunk of polished obsidian. It was followed by another and then 2 more. Within a minute, the street was filled with them. They poured in like a black river of steel and leather, an invading army moving with disciplined, unnerving precision. They were Hell's Angels. Their vests, their cuts, were emblazoned with the iconic Death's Head insignia, a symbol that carried with it a mythology of fear and fierce loyalty. There were dozens of them, 20, then 40, then 60, the final count settling at a staggering 70 bikes. They didn't just park. They occupied the street. They formed a perfect, intimidating cordon around Ricky Thorne's 2-story colonial house, blocking it off from the rest of the world. Each rider found a spot, brought their machine to a halt, and then, one by one, they killed their engines. The sudden, profound silence that descended was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a heavy, watchful, predatory silence, broken only by the occasional creak of worn leather and the metallic click of a kickstand hitting the pavement. The air grew thick with the smell of hot metal, exhaust, and an unspoken promise of retribution. Ricky Thorne was in his living room, watching a game on his oversized flat-screen TV, a bottle of expensive beer in his hand. When the rumbling started, he assumed it was a low-flying plane or a distant train. But it didn't fade. It grew until his windows rattled. Annoyed, he stalked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. His jaw went slack. His manicured lawn was surrounded. His escape was cut off. His safe, comfortable world had been encircled by a nightmare. He saw the patches, the grim, bearded faces, the cold, unblinking stares. These weren't local weekend warriors. This was the real thing. This was a force of nature he had foolishly provoked. His blood ran cold, the beer bottle slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers and shattering on his hardwood floor. Fear, raw and primal, seized him. He backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sun had set, and the angels had come. From the center of the silent phalanx of bikers, one man dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. He was older than most of the others, his beard shot through with gray, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. A patch on his vest above the death's head read preacher. He wasn't a man of God in the traditional sense, but he was the spiritual leader of this chapter, the keeper of their code. He moved to the front of the line, his steel-toed boots making no sound on the asphalt, and simply stood there, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes fixed on Ricky Thorne's front door. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His presence, amplified by the 70 silent statues behind him, was a judgment. The text from the local biker network had been forwarded up the chain of command with astonishing speed. The description of the patch, black rectangle, 3 white stripes, was immediately recognized. 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. An elite unit, a brotherhood forged in the hottest fires. For Preacher, the name on the store's receipt, Samuel Vance, struck a deeper chord. Years ago, his own son, a young Marine, had been caught in an ambush in the Karengal Valley. His squad was pinned down, taking heavy casualties, their radio shot to hell. A ranger unit operating nearby heard the firefight and, against their own orders, broke from their patrol to intervene. They laid down suppressing fire, called in air support, and dragged the wounded Marines to safety. Preacher's son was one of them. He had survived because of the courage of strangers who wore that same patch. He had never learned their names, only their unit. Now, one of those men, a man named Vance, had been knocked to the ground in a grocery store over a handful of change. For Preacher, this wasn't just about disrespect. It was about a sacred debt. Another biker, a man they called Deacon, stepped forward. His own younger brother had served in the 75th, in the same battalion as Sam. "Preacher," Deacon said, his voice a low rumble. "My brother, Kevin, he told me about a guy named Vance. Said they called him the Mule not as an insult, because he carried everything. Not just his own gear, but extra water, extra ammo, anything the other guys needed. On his last tour, he carried a wounded man nearly 3 clicks over rocky terrain to the LZ after their vehicle hit an IED. The man he carried lived. Vance got his leg shredded by shrapnel for his trouble. The bikers listened, their expressions grim. These were not just stories. They were testimonies. The quiet, broken man from the grocery store was being reassembled before their eyes, not as a victim, but as a legend. As the bikers stood their silent vigil, the neighbors began to creep out of their houses, drawn by the incredible spectacle. Sarah, the cashier, was there, having been told where to go by her brother. She began to speak, her voice trembling but clear, telling anyone who would listen what she had seen. The fall, the dignity, the quiet act of charity in the parking lot. The truth about Sam Vance was finally coming to light, illuminated by the cold chrome glare of 70 Harley-Davidsons. The bikers held their position through the night. They didn't drink, they didn't speak. They simply stood, a silent, immovable wall of leather and steel. The message was clear, delivered with more power than any threat could ever convey. This street, this town, was now under their protection, and the man inside the house had violated their code. Inside, Ricky Thorne descended into a state of pure terror. He called the police, but when the 2 bewildered officers arrived and saw the scene, they simply parked their cruiser at the end of the block and reported that it was a peaceful gathering. They were not going to intervene. Ricky was on his own. He spent the night huddled in his basement, listening to the profound silence from outside, a silence that screamed his guilt. By dawn, a for sale sign, hastily scrawled on a piece of cardboard, was stuck in Ricky Thorne's lawn. A moving truck, summoned in the dead of night, was loaded with a few panicked essentials. Before the sun was fully up, Rick Thorne, his face pale and drawn, fled his own home, his obnoxious truck speeding away without a backward glance. He was gone. The bikers watched him go, their faces impassive. Their objective had been achieved without a single punch being thrown. Justice, in their world, was often a matter of overwhelming presence. With their vigil concluded, the procession of motorcycles rumbled to life and moved as one. But they didn't leave town. They snaked through the quiet morning streets until they reached a small, run-down house on the forgotten edge of Harmony Creek. Sam Vance's house. The fence was sagging, the paint was peeling, and the lawn was a collection of overgrown weeds. Sam heard the engines and came to his front porch, his heart pounding with a familiar sense of dread. He expected more trouble, more confrontation. Instead, he watched in stunned silence as the bikers dismounted and, without a word, began to work. They moved with the same quiet efficiency they had displayed on Rick Street. Some began tearing down the old fence. Others produced tools and started repairing the loose shingles on his roof. A group of them fired up lawnmowers and weed whackers, attacking the overgrown yard with military precision. They were rebuilding his home, restoring his fortress. After an hour of silent, furious work, Preacher broke away from the group. He walked up the porch steps, stopping a respectful distance from Sam. He held something in his hand. It was a cane, but it wasn't a standard medical device. It was a piece of art, carved from a single piece of dark, polished oak. The handle was a perfectly sculpted representation of the 75th Ranger Regiment's crest. Preacher held it out to Sam. "We heard you had some trouble," Preacher said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "We don't stand for that." He looked at Sam's old, worn jacket, his eyes lingering on the faded patch. "The world forgets," he continued, his gaze meeting Sam's. "But we don't. Brotherhood is brotherhood." He pressed the cane into Sam's hand. "Respect," Preacher said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration. For the first time in 12 years, Sam Vance felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He gripped the smooth, strong wood of the cane, a lifeline in a world that had tried to drown him. The bikers finished their work by midday. The fence was straight and new, the lawn was immaculate, and the roof was sound. They packed their tools, mounted their bikes, and prepared to leave. They had not asked for thanks, nor did they expect it. Their actions were their own reward, an affirmation of their code. As the 70 engines roared to life in a deafening chorus, Preacher gave Sam a slow, deliberate nod. Then the thunder receded, leaving the small house in a state of renewed dignity. But they did not abandon him. As the main group disappeared over the horizon, 2 bikes broke off from the pack. They quietly took up positions at opposite ends of Sam Street, their riders settling in for a long watch. They were sentinels, a permanent guarantee that no one would ever disrespect this ground again. The transformation of the town was almost as swift. The story of what had happened, all of it, spread like wildfire. The tale of Rick's bullying, Sam's quiet grace, and the bikers' stunning intervention became local legend overnight. The community, jolted from its apathy, was awash with a collective sense of shame and a newfound respect. The next day, Mr. Henderson from the Valley Mart showed up at Sam's door, his face flushed with embarrassment, offering Sam free groceries for a year. Sarah, the cashier, arrived with a freshly baked apple pie, her eyes conveying an apology her words could not. People who had once looked through him now met his gaze with nods of deference. They saw him now, not the gimp, not the cripple, but Sergeant Samuel Vance, the mule, the man who carried more than his share. In the quiet evenings that followed, Sam would sit on his repaired porch, the magnificent oak cane resting against his chair. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He was a part of something. He had his home, his dignity, and the unspoken loyalty of a brotherhood he had never asked to join but had earned through a lifetime of quiet honor. The distant, rumbling growl of a Harley passing on the main road was no longer just noise. It was a comforting, familiar sound. It was the sound of angels watching over him. It was the sound of respect, secured not by a weapon or a threat, but by the enduring strength of a good man who refused to be broken. He was not alone anymore. He was home.